The metallic hum of the shuttle reverberated softly as Princess Alara stared out the viewport, her violet eyes scanning the vastness of space. The stars glimmered like scattered crystals across a black ocean. Far away from her home on Ryloria, a planet known for its shimmering skies and floating cities, Alara was heir to the throne, a lineage built on power, intellect, and most importantly an unwavering loyalty to Ryloria's traditions. She was always in control, unbothered by the weaknesses that seem so common among lesser species. Her mission here, among the strange blue-green world of Earth, was nothing more than a diplomatic formality. Her father, the king, had deemed it important to maintain peace with humans, a species he called barely civilized. To Alara, they were nothing more than emotionally erratic beings, far too reliant on primitive notions like love and honor, concepts she found exhausting and ultimately futile. Her advisors had briefed her endlessly on human emotions, as if they were fragile creatures bound by their hearts rather than their minds. Alara glanced at her escort, a silent human guard assigned to her by Earth's ambassador. The human's name was David. His appearance was average by her standards, his frame sturdy, his jawline sharp. She'd been assured he was one of the Earth's finest protectors, trained in combat and diplomacy. His expression remained unreadable as he sat across from her, hands folded, gaze forward. "Do you always look so serious?" Alara asked, her voice carrying a subtle disdain. David looked at her, his hazel eyes soft yet piercing. "Duty doesn't allow for much else, Your Highness." Duty. She rolled the word on her tongue, tasting its weight. You humans put such significance on service. Yet you're driven by something as weak as emotion. Doesn't that make you vulnerable? David didn't flinch, though a slight flicker crossed his eyes. Emotion can be a source of strength, Your Highness. Especially love. It gives us purpose. Alara felt a pang of irritation. Purpose, she thought, was derived from power, from the honor of one's lineage, not from some base connection to others. Yet her curiosity tugged at her. They touched down in one of Earth's more protected zones, a sprawling green landscape interrupted only by the distant peaks of mountains. Alara stepped onto the grass, her thin metal boots sinking slightly into the soft earth. She took a deep breath, her nostrils flaring as she adjusted to the unfamiliar scent of the place, damp, alive, and saturated with a rawness Ryloria lacked. David followed close behind, scanning the area, his hand hovering near his weapon. Alara found his caution amusing. Earth was nowhere near as dangerous as Ryloria. "Relax, David. No harm will come to me here." David's gaze remained vigilant. "Forgive me, Your Highness, but that's precisely why I'm here." Alara suppressed a smirk. His protective nature, so grounded in emotion, would serve little in a true crisis. The Rylorians knew no fear, not in the same way humans did. A light flickered to her left, drawing her attention. A group of officials and diplomats stood nearby, Earth's ambassador at the forefront. They exchanged greetings, the ambassador's words flowing as easily as water, but Alara found herself distracted. Her attention kept drifting to the humans, their small gestures, the way their expressions shifted, each movement layered with a nuance that was both intriguing and puzzling. Several days passed in meetings and formalities, each as tedious as the last. Alara's impatience grew as she listened to endless discussions of trade, technology, and mutual defense. Yet one figure continued to occupy her thoughts. David's silent presence was like a shadow, always there yet never intruding. He was dutiful, always aware, yet there was an unsettling steadiness in him that unsettled her. Even after hours of walking through long corridors and empty halls, he showed no sign of fatigue or irritation. One evening, as the amber sunset cast long shadows across the garden of their temporary residence, Alara paused by a small pond. The water was still, reflecting the pink and orange hues of the sky. David stood a respectful distance behind her, but Alara turned, gesturing for him to come closer. "Tell me, David," she said, her tone more curious than commanding, "what is it that makes you so dedicated to serving, to protecting me, someone you hardly know?" David's gaze softened slightly, and he seemed to consider his words carefully. "When I took my oath, I swore to protect, no matter who or what. Honor is something we hold close, Your Highness, even if it means laying down our lives." She raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. You would die for a stranger? A faint smile touched his lips. If it meant preserving peace, then yes. Alara studied him, searching for any sign of doubt or arrogance. She found none. The sincerity in his eyes unsettled her, the quiet assurance that spoke of a strength that didn't need to boast. It was a strength rooted in something beyond logic or duty, a strength that defied her understanding. That night, a soft knock came at her door. She opened it to find David, his face serious, his gaze intense. "Your Highness," he said in a low tone, "we need to evacuate. There's been a breach in security. Unidentified forces have been detected near our location." Alara's pulse quickened, though she kept her composure. She allowed David to lead her through the dimly lit corridors, his presence somehow calming despite the rising tension. She could hear distant murmurs and the soft footfalls of guards moving in formation, their bodies tense, their hands on their weapons. As they moved into the courtyard, the silence shattered with a sudden explosion. The ground shook beneath them, sending Alara stumbling. David's arm was instantly around her, steadying her, shielding her as debris rained down from above. She looked up, stunned, as shadows moved through the smoke, figures clad in dark armor, their forms sleek and menacing. The attackers moved swiftly, and it became clear that they weren't here for negotiation. Alara could see the precision in their movements, the ruthless efficiency as they cut through the guards like they were mere obstacles. The realization hit her: this wasn't an attack on Earth. It was a targeted strike. A strike on her. One of the assailants lunged toward her, a sleek blade in hand, but David moved faster. In a flash, he drew his weapon, intercepting the strike with a force that sent the attacker stumbling backward. Alara felt a strange twist in her chest as she watched him fight, his movements fluid, powerful, and unwavering. More assailants closed in, their eyes fixed on Alara. She could see it now, their intention was clear. They meant to take her, to use her as leverage against Ryloria, or perhaps even eliminate her entirely. David fought with a ferocity she had never seen, his body moving in perfect harmony with his weapon, his eyes sharp and unyielding. Yet, even as he fought, she could see that he was outnumbered. One by one, her guards fell, leaving only David between her and the encroaching attackers. Her mind raced, grappling with the unfamiliar sensation of fear. She, a Rylorian princess who had always been in control, was now utterly vulnerable. "Run!" David's voice cut through her thoughts, his tone laced with urgency. "I'll hold them off." For a moment she hesitated, torn between her pride and the gnawing instinct to survive. But his eyes locked onto hers, and she saw something there, of fierce determination, an unspoken promise. He was willing to die for her. She, who had looked at humans with nothing but scorn, was now at the mercy of one. Without another word, she turned and ran, her heart pounding as she fled into the shadows. The sounds of battle faded behind her, but her mind remained fixed on David, on his unwavering resolve, on the impossible depth she had glimpsed in his eyes. It was as if, in that single moment, her understanding of him, of humans, had shifted, leaving her shaken and unsteady. She ran, desperate to escape, yet haunted by a single, inescapable question. Why would he choose to die for her? Alara's footsteps echoed as she dashed down the narrow corridors, her heart racing with an urgency she couldn't remember ever feeling. For the first time, the strength she had always prided herself on felt hollow, inadequate against the chaotic storm of emotions raging within her. She barely knew this human, yet the sight of him risking everything for her, it gnawed at her, made her feel weak in a way that no enemy or threat had ever managed to. Her mind was screaming at her to keep going, to flee as far from the attackers as possible. But every step took her further from the sounds of struggle, and with it the last defense between her and the forces hunting her down. She tried to force her mind into logic, to tell herself that David's sacrifice was the logical choice, a tool used to preserve her safety. Yet even as she struggled to make sense of it, the burning in her chest didn't relent. She slowed, every instinct she had trained for survival clashing with an unfamiliar but irresistible urge. She stopped. Her breathing was heavy, her hands trembling as she clenched them into fists. She, Alara, Princess of Ryloria, was not someone who turned her back. Not when she was the target, not when someone was willing to lay down their life for her. The sounds of fighting echoed distantly, followed by the chilling silence that settled after a fatal blow. Her heart lurched, and against all her reason, she turned and began to make her way back. The twisting hallways and the distant echoes disoriented her, but finally she spotted a glimmer of movement through the lingering smoke. Her vision focused on the figure ahead, David, bloodied but standing, breathing heavily as he held his weapon tightly, his back against the wall. David turned, his face a mixture of shock and anger as he saw her approaching. "What are you doing?" he hissed, voice laced with frustration. "You should have escaped by now." Alara lifted her chin, forcing herself to regain her composure despite the tremor in her voice. "I couldn't leave you behind. Not after what you've done." David's jaw tightened. "My life is expendable. Yours isn't. I can hold them off longer if—" Before he could finish, another wave of attackers rounded the corner, weapons raised. David reacted instantly, pulling Alara behind him as he unleashed a hail of gunfire. But he was injured, his movements slower than before, his aim just a fraction less precise. The attackers closed in, their blades glinting under the dim lights. Alara took a deep breath, every lesson in combat and strategy she had ever learned rushing to the forefront of her mind. She was no stranger to fighting, on Ryloria, all members of the royal family trained from a young age. Grabbing a discarded weapon from one of the fallen attackers, she joined the fray, standing shoulder to shoulder with David. Together they fought, their movements synchronized in an unspoken dance of survival. Their attackers were relentless, but one by one, Alara and David whittled down their numbers. The corridors echoed with the clash of metal and the heavy breaths of exertion. Just as the last attacker fell, silence blanketed the space around them, broken only by their labored breathing. Alara glanced at David, who was slumped against the wall, his face pale, a deep gash running down his arm. "You're hurt," she said, her voice uncharacteristically gentle. David managed a weak smile. "Nothing I haven't faced before, Your Highness." She was surprised by the warmth that stirred in her chest at his resilience, but it was quickly replaced by worry. She had seen enough combat wounds to know that his injury was serious. Her gaze traveled over him, noticing bruises and cuts she hadn't seen before in the chaos of the battle. But more than the physical wounds, there was an exhaustion in his eyes, a weariness that went beyond the immediate fight. "You didn't have to do this for me," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "You could have left, saved yourself." David's eyes softened, a strange gentleness filling them as he looked at her. "Protecting you is my duty, Your Highness. But more than that, it was my choice." "Choice," Alara echoed, word foreign in this context. On Ryloria, duty was everything. Choice rarely entered the equation, especially for those in positions of service. He nodded slowly, as if gathering his thoughts. "Duty brought me here, but choice kept me here. You're more than just an assignment to me, Alara. If my life can buy your safety, I'd give it willingly." Her chest tightened at the sound of her name from his lips, stripped of the usual formality. No one had ever dared to speak to her in such a way, to look at her with such devotion. The intensity of it was overwhelming, sparking emotions she couldn't quite grasp. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, the unfamiliar vulnerability twisting inside her like a knife. "Why?" she asked softly, a question as much for herself as for him. "Why would you choose that?" A shadow of pain flickered across his face, but his voice remained steady. "Because sometimes it's not about survival. It's about what you're willing to stand for, even if it's for someone who might not understand." The words struck her deeply, resonating in a place she had buried long ago. She thought of her life, shaped by duty and honor, devoid of personal connections. The idea that someone would willingly give themselves, not out of obligation but from something deeper, something as irrational and powerful as choice, had defied everything she had been taught. She looked back at him, a strange resolve settling over her. "Then, if we survive this," she began, her voice low but steady, "I want to understand." David's gaze softened, a glint of surprise and warmth in his eyes. "Then we'll make it through," he replied, determination lacing his words. "I'll make sure of it." They made their way through the damaged corridors, every step laced with an understanding that neither of them spoke aloud. Alara could feel the shift within herself, the old walls of pride and detachment crumbling as something new, something raw, began to take shape. As they reached an open courtyard, they encountered a large squadron of human soldiers arriving as backup. They rushed forward, securing the area and checking the wounded. Alara could feel the weight of the ordeal lifting, but a strange emptiness filled her instead. She glanced at David, who was being tended to by a medic, his injuries finally receiving the attention they deserved. She approached him, waiting until the medic moved aside. "When you're healed," she said, her voice carrying a surprising intensity, "I want you to stay by my side, not as a guard, but as an ally." David's expression softened, his weariness momentarily forgotten. "It would be my honor, Alara." As they made their way back to her quarters, Alara felt a strange calm settle over her. She had been a stranger to the concept of choice, to the depths that humans seem to draw from without hesitation. But David had shown her something beyond duty, beyond logic, something unbreakable. In the days that followed, David remained close. And true to her word, Alara began to learn, to observe the nuances that made him who he was. She watched the way he interacted with the other guards, his quiet but steadfast presence comforting them, inspiring loyalty without demanding it. She saw the way he looked at the world, the way he found strength in vulnerability, in connections that went beyond bloodlines or tradition. Their bond deepened, a silent understanding forming between them, one that went beyond words or titles. Alara found herself drawn to his laughter, his quiet determination, the way he saw her not as a princess but as a person, capable of both strength and weakness. One evening, as they stood beneath the stars, David turned to her, his gaze filled with a warmth that left her breathless. "Did you find the answer you were looking for?" he asked softly. Alara nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I think I did. Love isn't about logic or duty. It's about choice. And I choose this." David's hand brushed hers, tentative but steady. She grasped it, feeling the quiet certainty in his touch. They stood together in the silence, two souls bound not by duty, but by a shared understanding, a connection that transcended their differences. And in that moment, beneath the vastness of the universe, Alara knew that her life had been forever changed. She had glimpsed the true strength within the human heart, and she was ready to walk beside it, wherever it might lead. As the days turned into weeks, Alara and David settled into a rhythm, one that blended their lives and responsibilities with an ease that neither had anticipated. The treaty negotiations proceeded smoothly, Earth and Ryloria finding common ground despite their differences. Yet, within the political framework of their duties, a quiet bond blossomed, one that neither of them sought to define or explain. Alara was acutely aware of the whispers among the Rylorian officials and Earth's ambassadors. Her close association with David did not go unnoticed. She was the crown princess after all, and every move she made was scrutinized by both worlds. And yet, she found herself caring less and less about the opinions swirling around her. Her priorities had shifted, shaped by the unexpected loyalty and strength she had found in David. One afternoon, as Alara sat in the sprawling gardens of the embassy grounds, a Rylorian advisor named Varen approached her, his expression stern. Varen had served her father for decades, a staunch traditionalist whose loyalty to the throne was unquestionable. "Your Highness," Varen began, bowing respectfully, though his gaze held a hint of concern. "I wish to speak to you about your conduct during these negotiations." Alara inclined her head, masking her irritation. She knew exactly what this was about. "Go on, Varen." He shifted uncomfortably before continuing. "There has been talk, Your Highness. Concerns among the council that your association with the human guard is inappropriate. It is unbecoming of a Rylorian princess to be seen with someone of such low station." A flicker of anger rose within her, but she kept her expression neutral. "David is not just a guard. He has proven himself invaluable in protecting me, at great personal cost. His actions warrant respect, not judgment." Varen's expression hardened, though he kept his voice measured. "Respect, perhaps, but affection, Your Highness. Surely you understand that such ties could endanger the throne's reputation. The Rylorian people expect you to uphold our values, not be swayed by the sentiments of a lesser species." Alara felt her hands clench into fists, her pulse quickening. "And what of our values, Varen? Are they so fragile that an alliance with a human could shatter them?" Varen stiffened. "It is not a matter of fragility, but of honor. You are to be queen one day, Your Highness. Your duty is to our people, to the traditions that have upheld our kingdom for centuries." For a moment, Alara felt the weight of her heritage settle over her, a familiar weight she had borne since childhood. But that weight, once so absolute, now felt like chains holding her back. "Perhaps our traditions need reevaluation," she replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil within her. Varen's mouth opened as if to argue, but he caught the firm resolve in her gaze and bowed instead. "As you wish, Your Highness," he said, his tone edged with a barely concealed disappointment. He departed, leaving Alara alone in the gardens, her mind awash with conflicting thoughts. When she returned to her quarters later that evening, David was waiting for her, his expression a mix of warmth and concern. "Is everything all right?" he asked, his voice soft yet filled with understanding. Alara sank onto a chair, rubbing her temples. "One of my advisors reminded me of my duty. Apparently associating with a human is an affront to Rylorian values." David's face remained calm, though a shadow passed over his eyes. "Their concern for their traditions, Alara. I understand that." She looked up at him, her gaze fierce. "But you don't deserve their judgment. You've been nothing but honorable, loyal, and yet, in their eyes, you're unworthy simply because of where you were born." He moved closer, his presence calming her. "I'm not here for their approval, Alara. I'm here for you." His hand brushed hers, a simple, grounding touch that carried a world of meaning. In that moment, all the conflicts, expectations, and judgments faded into the background. Alara leaned into his touch, allowing herself the rare freedom to be vulnerable, to let go of the constraints of duty, if only for a little while. As the negotiations came to a close, the time for Alara's departure from Earth loomed closer. The treaty had been a success, promising an era of peace and cooperation between their worlds. The diplomatic work was complete, yet Alara found herself dreading the thought of leaving. She had come to know Earth as more than just a political ally. It was a place that had transformed her view of the galaxy and her heart. One evening, just days before her scheduled departure, Alara and David found themselves walking through the quiet outskirts of the embassy gardens. The stars stretched above them, the sky clear and vast, mirroring the uncertainty that lay ahead. David glanced at her, his expression serious. "When you return to Ryloria, things will change, won't they?" Alara nodded, the weight of her responsibilities settling over her once more. "Yes. I'll take on more formal duties, perhaps even a binding engagement to solidify alliances." David's jaw clenched subtly, but he kept his voice steady. "And what about us?" The question hung between them, filled with unspoken fears and possibilities. She reached out, taking his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin against hers. "I don't want this to end," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't want to return to a life where I'm expected to ignore what I've learned here, what I feel for you." David's hand tightened around hers. "Then don't," he replied simply, his gaze unwavering. "We'll find a way. If you're willing to stand up against the expectations of your world, so am I." Alara's heart pounded, torn between the certainty she felt with him and the daunting reality of her duty. She had always known her path, had accepted it without question. But now, that path felt hollow compared to the connection she had forged with David. The night was quiet, as if holding its breath for them. Alara looked up at the stars, her thoughts racing. "I don't know what the future holds," she admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "But I know that I don't want a future without you in it." David's eyes softened, and he reached up, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then we'll face it together," he said, a quiet strength in his words. "No matter what it takes." As the dawn approached, they returned to the embassy, the weight of their decisions settling over them like the morning mist. Alara knew the path ahead would not be easy. There would be opposition from both her people and his, and the challenges would be unrelenting. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that perhaps, together, they could defy the expectations of their worlds. The final day of her stay on Earth arrived, and the halls of the embassy were filled with officials and diplomats congratulating each other on the success of the treaty. Alara moved through the crowd, her composure intact, though her mind was elsewhere. David stood at the edge of the gathering, watching her with a quiet intensity. Their eyes met across the room, and in that brief glance, an entire conversation passed between them. They didn't need words. They both knew what lay ahead, the sacrifices and risks they would take to be together. As she made her way toward the shuttle that would take her back to Ryloria, David stepped forward, standing close enough for only her to hear. "I'll come to Ryloria," he said softly, his voice filled with conviction. "Whatever it takes, I'll be there." Alara nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and sorrow. "I'll be waiting," she replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. With one last glance, she boarded the shuttle, feeling a profound sense of loss as the doors closed behind her. The engines hummed to life, and she watched Earth recede into the distance, a world that had given her not just an alliance, but a purpose beyond her royal duties. The journey back to Ryloria was long and filled with reflection. Her mind drifted over every moment she had shared with David, the way he had challenged her beliefs, broken down the walls she had so carefully constructed, and shown her a side of herself she had never known. She was returning as a different person, a transformation she knew would not go unnoticed. Upon her arrival, Alara was immediately swept into a whirlwind of royal responsibilities. Her father greeted her with pride, and the court officials praised her success in securing the treaty. Yet beneath the praise and formalities, she sensed an underlying tension, an awareness that her time on Earth had changed her in ways they couldn't ignore. As the days passed, her father began arranging meetings with noble suitors, suggesting alliances that would strengthen Ryloria's influence. Alara attended these gatherings, her mind drifting as she entertained potential partners, none of whom stirred even a fraction of the emotions she felt with David. The weight of her duty pressed down on her, a constant reminder of the expectations she was meant to uphold. But each night, as she lay beneath the shimmering skies of Ryloria, her thoughts returned to David. She replayed their final moments together, his promise echoing in her mind. She clung to that promise, even as the days stretched into weeks, her hope flickering but never fully extinguished. Then, one evening, as the sky darkened and the stars began to twinkle, a message arrived. It was encoded, barely legible due to the strict monitoring of communications with Earth, but the message was clear enough. He was coming. Alara's heart raced as she read the message. David had found a way. Despite the risks, despite the countless obstacles between their worlds, he was coming to Ryloria. She held the message close, feeling a rush of exhilaration and fear all at once. Her mind churned with questions. How would he make it through the royal security? What kind of danger would he face? But beneath her worry was a fierce determination. She would find a way to protect him, just as he had done for her. For the next few days, Alara prepared in secret, arranging for discreet guards to cover the entrance to a small, secluded garden on the palace grounds. It was a quiet spot, nestled under the ethereal glow of Ryloria's floating crystals, where only the stars and the soft hum of the crystals would witness their reunion. She kept her preparations hidden from her father and advisors, knowing they would never approve of a human's presence within the royal grounds. The night David was set to arrive, Alara waited in the garden, her pulse racing. Every sound, every movement of the night creature seemed amplified. She felt a mix of exhilaration and nerves, a vulnerability she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. And then, through the thick shadows of the garden, she saw him. David stepped forward, his figure slightly weary from the journey but his eyes alight with a fierce determination. She moved toward him, feeling a rush of relief and joy that she couldn't contain. In an instant they were together, her hands in his, the weight of the past few weeks melting away. "Alara," he breathed, a warmth in his voice that seemed to fill every empty space within her. "I promised you." She smiled, unable to hide the emotion in her eyes. "And you kept it." They spent hours beneath the stars, talking in quiet tones, their words a balm for all the days they'd spent apart. David told her of the challenges he'd faced to get to Ryloria, the careful maneuvers to avoid detection, the allies he'd found among Earth's diplomats who believed in their cause. Alara, in turn, shared the mounting pressures within her court, the suitors who seemed oblivious to the fact that her heart already belonged to someone else. As the dawn approached, reality began to creep back into their secluded haven. Alara knew they couldn't remain hidden forever. The court would discover David's presence, and her father would demand an explanation. Yet, as she looked into David's steady gaze, she felt a resolve within her, stronger than the weight of duty that had once defined her. Stay, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Stay with me here in Ryloria. I don't care what they say. I want this, David. I want us. David hesitated, his eyes filled with both love and concern. Alara, if they find out if your father... I'll face him, she interrupted, her tone firm. We'll face him together. I'm not the same person I was when I left Ryloria. I can't go back to that life, to a future without choice. Just then, a shadow fell over them, and Alara looked up to see her father standing at the edge of the garden, flanked by advisors. The king's expression was one of cold fury, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of his daughter standing so close to a human. What is this? The king demanded, his voice reverberating through the quiet garden. Alara, explain yourself. David took a protective step in front of her, but she gently moved forward, standing tall as she faced her father. Her heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. This is David, father. He saved my life on earth, protected me when our guards fell, and he's here because I love him. She took a breath, gathering her courage. And I will not hide that from you or anyone else. A ripple of shock moved through the advisors, their whispers sharp and disapproving. The king's face remained hard, his gaze shifting from Alara to David. You would forsake your duty, your bloodline, for a fleeting connection to a human. Alara's voice rose, filled with conviction. This is more than a fleeting connection. David has shown me what it means to choose one's path, to be more than a role or a title. I can still serve Ryloria, still uphold our traditions, but I refuse to do so at the cost of my heart. The king's expression softened, almost imperceptibly, though his eyes remained guarded. You risk destabilizing our alliances, our legacy for him? David stepped forward, meeting the king's gaze with a steady resolve. Your Highness, I understand your concerns. I know I'm just a human in your eyes, but I came here to honor your daughter's choice, and I will protect her and your people if that's what she chooses. He glanced at Alara, a quiet strength in his gaze. I'm not asking for your throne or your approval. I'm just asking for the chance to be by her side. Silence settled over the garden, the weight of David's words hanging between them. The king looked from David to his daughter, his gaze softening as he saw the unwavering determination in her eyes. He took a deep breath, his face a mixture of resignation and understanding. Very well, he said slowly, his tone thoughtful. If this is truly what you want, Alara, then you have my permission. He looked directly at David, his gaze sharp. But understand this, human, if you harm her or betray her trust, I will have you cast from this planet. Am I clear? David nodded solemnly, his voice steady. I understand, Your Highness. I would never do anything to harm her. The king regarded them both for a long moment, then turned, his advisors trailing after him, their faces a mixture of shock and disapproval. Alara watched them leave, a strange lightness filling her chest as she realized that, for the first time in her life, her choice had been heard and respected. Once they were alone again, David looked at her, his expression a mixture of awe and relief. You did it. Alara laughed, a sound filled with joy and disbelief. No, we did it. She took his hands, pulling him close, a radiant smile lighting up her face. David, I don't know what the future holds, but I know that with you I feel stronger, more alive than I ever have. David's arms wrapped around her, holding her close as he whispered, I'll stand by you, no matter where that future takes us. And so, under the light of Ryloria's twin moons, they stood together, bound not by duty or tradition, but by a choice that transcended worlds. They had defied the odds, broken through the expectations of their people, and carved out a path uniquely their own. In the end, Alara knew that the journey ahead would be challenging, that their love would be tested by the scrutiny of both worlds. But for the first time she felt the strength of a love that was not bound by duty or obligation, a love that had been forged in loyalty and sacrifice. And she knew that together, they could face anything that lay ahead.